Hello, YouTube. I want to talk a little bit about art today, or just creativity in general, but please don't think this is just for arty people. I'm hoping that anyone can dip in and out and find some knowledge-based value in these chats, at least in terms of aiming towards a more meaningful and disciplined life, both creatively and emotionally. Sharing my experience is the least I can do in return for the support I've received for my work. So, to explain a bit about me and why practicing art and creativity in general became more of a necessity for me in order to function out in the world in a more sustainable capacity, I guess. So, about 8 or 9 years ago, I was faced with the possibility of losing my entire family, or immediate family, I should say. Mum to breast cancer, dad to a rare frontotemporal dementia called Pick's disease, and my brother to other sort of life-threatening issues. However subjectively dramatic this all seemed at the time, I'm aware how unfortunately common and more severe these issues can be. And as tragic as it was to lose my dad, fortunately Mum and my brother both recovered. And just to assure you, this is not intended as a sob story. So having found this all out in a week or so was particularly daunting, as I was already experiencing sporadic panic attacks, having also just broken up with a long-term girlfriend at the time. I've also suffered with relatively severe and consistent mental health and dietary issues in the past. But prior to finding this out, I was unusually fragile, living a life without any structure or discipline, combined with a lot of binge drinking, eating crap, not exercising, and generally not knowing how to take care of myself, really. All of which resulted in a very immature and self-absorbed reaction to that situation. I was so caught up in that sort of victim mentality that I couldn't really put myself in their shoes or see their experience or how they were suffering, all of which only added a level of guilt and shame to an already shit situation. But once the reality of these illnesses became clear, it was obvious how useless that woe is me mentality was going to be for everyone involved. And whether I chose to take on that responsibility or if it was just forced on me, I still don't really know, which makes me think about that bigger sort of cliche question: do we need trauma or something awful to happen in order to grow and gain a wider perspective as human beings? Surely there's another way. And so I left behind my previous life and a lush circle of friends after 12 years-ish living and working in Brighton in the UK, and headed back home to care for my family in Gloucestershire, or the Shire, if you will. So at first, I felt overwhelmed and frustrated by this new responsibility, like the hopelessness and albeit fictional dread of whether I'd be able to look after myself if they did actually all die. That pushed me into a relatively brief but suicidal state of mind, which I had experienced thoughts like that before during bouts of major depression, but this time they felt less abstract and more logical in a weird way. But I should say I didn't act on those thoughts, whether it was the guilt of leaving Mum on her own or having some formal training in mindfulness and whatnot. It didn't really matter. I think survival mode actually just kicked in unconsciously at that point. A lot of us don't have the luxury of a support network like I did with my mum, and unfortunately suicide has become much more prevalent amongst young men in the last few decades apparently, and there does seem to be a bit of a meaning crisis evolving in our current culture, or at least that we're now becoming aware of. I actually thought about this last night, and I'm going to link some lectures in the description below that I found on YouTube about this stuff by an awesome guy called John Vervaeke, I think that's how you pronounce it, who basically breaks down why and how it seems like we're all fucked. But he references all the intellectual and philosophical reasons behind it, so I defo recommend listening to those if you have time. So shortly after that, albeit subjective breaking point, a few weeks later, we made the impossible decision to take Dad into a care home as his cognition had rapidly declined beyond our capability of caring for him. And so I naively volunteered to take him in instead of Mum, being how weak she was from the radiotherapy at the time, and just the emotional dilemma of making that decision itself. Taking on that responsibility, I felt the parental roles reverse for the first time, which I think was quite scary, but also brought a surprising sense of bravery, which was instantly shut down by the event itself being considerably more dramatic and painful than I imagined. And to this day was an experience I still feel morally ambivalent about. It felt a bit like putting an animal in a cage and just running away. A few days later, Mum and I agreed we couldn't put our lives on hold while waiting for more diagnoses for everyone. And since we're both artists, Mum is a mosaicist, and we understand and have experienced how healing creativity can be, we both started making a bit of artwork. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. We just needed to start something at that point to distract ourselves, I think. So she started a new mosaic and I started a new painting. And within the first few hours of clearing the space in my studio, I remember feeling a bit calmer. Then over the next few days, my mind state shifted from catastrophe into a more rational, yet still somber perception of the whole situation. And as the artwork came to life, some much needed drips of dopamine helped me to hold my attention in the present moment, just on the brushstrokes and colours. I remember feeling like my brain was literally cooling down from this intense sense of anticipation, which also helped with my sleep, as I had insomnia at the time due to just generally overthinking everything. But I remember thinking, however intrinsically linked my recovery with painting seemed, that it was still a romantic sentiment, or a bit woo-woo maybe, considering it could have been any other creative activity or just neurological stuff happening. That being said, as I kept painting, I remember feeling a gradual but intense curiosity I'd not experienced before. I felt like impregnated with deep-rooted questions about the nature of reality and perception that seemed to arise from nowhere. I certainly wasn't smart or stupid enough to think of them myself, and so I naively imagined those new depths of psychological distress and coming relatively closer to my own mortality had somehow unlocked these existential or spiritual questions passed down throughout time, genetically, or from the universe. A lot of woo-woo kind of shit maybe, or maybe not. So some of you have probably heard of the philosopher Carl Jung and his idea of the collective unconscious. It's the idea that there's a part of our mind that we're not consciously aware of, but that we all share as humans. So it's not necessarily learned from life experience, it's instead something we're born with. It's just sort of baked into our brains. For example, some fears we have just seem instinctive or like pre-installed in a way. You don't need a prior bad experience to know a snake in your bed is terrifying. Your body already knows for some primal reason. But basically, these new thoughts that were popping up around that time just didn't feel like my own. It's one thing to read and learn about the psychological epiphanies that philosophers have explored for centuries, but they don't hit quite as hard as they do when we discover them for ourselves, which again, for some reason, tends to happen when something terrible happens. I began to wonder if the intensity of focus and attention our creative work demands can determine the depth of new and novelty ways to think, and in my case, being diagnosed with ADHD, whatever that means, and lacking the neurotypical levels of dopamine, I do sometimes require a more intensive, hyper-focused, detail-orientated challenge to remain stimulated. And so one theory I had, as I found this new painting so technically difficult, lots of like micro photorealistic detail and whatnot, is whether the practical intensity of whatever it is we're making or creating needs to match or be roughly equal to the emotional intensity of the trauma we have experienced in order to bring out these new and relevant perspectives and thoughts that are already within us but are kind of buried, laying dormant in a sense, and bring them to the surface or just unveil them in a sense. And it's those kind of universal philosophical thoughts, at least in my case, at that time, that just brought a much deeper rational understanding of that specific trauma I was going through and essentially just helped me make sense of it. It's a pretty wacky idea, I know, but it certainly felt that way at the time. I just remember thinking, although I was already obsessed with like self-help books and podcasts at the time, all these new thoughts were just popping into my head out of nowhere the more I paid attention to that painting. I'd read something written hundreds of years ago by some brilliant philosopher, Marcus Aurelius or whoever, and think, I had that exact thought yesterday. Obviously, he's just expressed it as a beautiful, perfectly formed sentence, while mine just existed as a vague idea in my head. But as the weeks turned to months, I began to suspect that painting or any creative act practiced over time with the relevant intensity and intention could potentially resemble the results of hallucinogenic therapies like using psilocybin or MDMA to treat patients with PTSD. I'm not saying creativity is as potent or direct as those methods might be, especially with the appropriate counselling, but by solving problems and working through the practical issues and inevitable fuck-ups that come with pretty much any creative task, I guess you're learning how to deal with things as they are happening in real time. And I think we can and do internalize those experiences metaphorically and carry them over into our everyday lives, providing us with what I consider to be the most essential capacity, which is the capacity to change and adapt out in the world in real time. Creativity can also promote meditative or flow state experiences, and practiced regularly can at least help to modulate feelings of resentment or anger, and in some cases can even feel psychedelic. And so by applying this intention of deeper focus and paying more attention in and to the process of painting, it didn't take long before I tapped into an oddly drug-like appreciation for, I guess, just something coming from nothing. After spending weeks on end, like 10 hours a day painting, like total tunnel vision on a microscopic level, watching the blank canvas slowly come to life, something very strange starts to happen to your brain. I guess it's an odd sort of godlike power that you are the one creating something out of nothing. And I know how that sounds. Does that mean I think artists are like gods? Obviously not. But is there a reason why churches and cathedrals are filled with artwork? Yes, maybe. But that's a whole other chat for another time. Like, divine inspiration is God speaking through us. Sort of depends on if you believe in God. But as every artist I've spoken to will probably tell you, once you really get into the flow of a complicated or just labor-intensive artwork or craft of some sort, it doesn't really feel like you're the one doing it after a while. It's more like you're a vessel that's communicating something deeper from somewhere else. I'd say that's quite a universal experience, but you tell me. So as I carried on painting and trying to really lock in and focus more of my attention into it, just sort of as an experiment, I started really tuning into my own sort of sensory perceptions, and I started to wonder whether all things appear the same in reality as they do in our conscious perception. For example, I remember learning that the colours we see are basically fabricated by our brains. They're not actually out there in the world, and in reality are in fact electromagnetic vibrations at a specific wavelength, whatever the fuck that means. So what's actually there then? A small group of us might agree on the colour red. A fly, on the other hand, sees an ultraviolet colour human eyes can't even detect. A dog, I think, will see a dark brownish grey or black. An owl sees a dark grey, I think, and so on. And so the way we process reality is, for the most part, exclusive to our species as humans. Our perception of colour is just that, a perception. Therefore, it's subjective, which is really creepy. So as I zoomed in closer and closer on what I was painting, I started to feel this almost nauseating curiosity. I began to wonder whether external reality is something the mind actively constructs as we're walking down the street, a kind of neurological illusion that helps us move through space and time. Because if we truly saw reality for what it is, our minds would basically explode. And that led to some even weirder thoughts, but very stimulating and weirdly exciting in some cases, like whether we're just minds floating around or whether the outside world only exists because we are perceiving it. I guess it's the classic philosophical debate. Does a tree fall in the woods if no one's about to see it or hear it? Physically, yes, the tree creates vibrations in the air, whether or not anyone is there, but philosophically, sound requires a listener. So without human perception, is it still a sound, or is it just vibrations? Therefore, does anything exist or matter if there's no witness or human awareness of that thing? During that time, I can remember leaving the flat in the morning and looking up at this hill just outside on the horizon, and I was sure that I was seeing trees or buildings that definitely weren't there the day before. But I know how this all sounds. As some of you may be thinking, the real question here might be whether these are the kind of thoughts that start popping up when we've spent too much time alone. Just shut up and get on with it. And I agree. There is a very fine line between solitude and isolation, but would we experience this deeper sense of curiosity and individuation as vividly without spending time alone in the creative process and finding comfort in our own company? Another question I'm sure we can also explore another time. A few of you might be checking out at this point, but however bonkers it all felt, I started to realize that whatever comes or came before the atoms and quarks, the stuff that makes up everything, including us, is something science still can't really explain unless I've missed something. And at some point it becomes a matter of faith in what you believe has made all of this possible. Faith in whatever exists beyond what we can observe or explain, sort of like what happened before the Big Bang. Us human apes can't really imagine nothingness. We can't help but put an image to nothing. We either think of all black when we close our eyes, or all white, or just empty spaces, none of which is nothing. It's impossible to imagine, although having a general anesthetic is a pretty good gauge, at least, to how nothing might feel, and maybe what death might be like, which can be a massive relief if you're afraid of death. You know, does our sense of consciousness carry on after the body dies? Slightly terrifying. It's this very surreal thing where the second the needle goes in is the very same second you wake up, and yet you've been unconscious, being operated on for the last 4 hours or whatever, but to you it was just like blinking. That was a massive turning point for me, experiencing that, and basically learning that we don't actually experience nothingness. So there's not much to worry about when we die. Touch wood. Sorry, I tend to go off tangent. You'll just have to get used to that. And so in quite an unexpected way, painting became a sort of path to a very personal kind of faith. Nothing like a religious faith. I'm probably an atheist. I say probably, which means I'm probably agnostic. But this period in my life really dissolved any assumptions about what God might be, as the word itself just carries too much imagery for me. I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but I kind of think of God now as the chemical elements that create everything, the isness of everything, and just how the basic building blocks of life, like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and so on, come together and form in the way they do and create this environment that surrounds us. That's always been plenty miraculous enough without the need for any supernatural being to have created it all. But of course, never say never. What do I know? I mean, just the simple fact that our bodies contain literal stardust from the Big Bang is, again, more than magical enough for me scientifically. And so, in the end, having finished that painting in such a vulnerable headspace, the whole experience just left me with a general feeling that I don't really know anything. And everything is kind of a miracle. So maybe the only sensible response is to just be much more grateful for everything in life and for life. But I don't necessarily think I would have come to that conclusion without having attempted to create something for myself and just experience how difficult and nuanced it is to create anything from nothing. And if you need any proof of this, just go and break something, smash it up, see how quick and easy that is, and then see how long and hard it is to put it back together. That analogy doesn't fully work, but you get my point. And by the way, going back to the collective unconscious, as we know, there's so many similarities in everyone's spiritual awakening or just big turning point in their lives, whether it's through psychedelics or whatnot. And I don't think those similarities make them any less significant. And I myself had already experienced that cliche sort of total gratitude and love for everything and every human being as I grew up in the late 90s and had the absolute privilege of experiencing the dance and rave culture back then, where you'd sort of just have these micro spiritual awakenings every weekend, dancing with everyone, which for me was fueled by music. But I'd never felt it quite this way before. Being completely sober and emotionally vulnerable, by just learning how to pay more attention in the moment, in this instance just on that painting, I discovered a much truer sense of gratitude and acceptance, which really seemed to stick, as I knew I could revisit that state of mind in a much healthier way just by paying attention to anything, really. You've probably heard the famous Albert Einstein quote, "There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle, and the other is as though everything is a miracle." And I think deep down, I'm probably a bit of a nihilist, as I think that quote really is a choice you need to make to direct your life, but that actually it might not make much difference either way, as I think both options can actually be true in some sense. You know, we probably are insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but for me, like before all this stuff happened, I think I was just a bit resentful. In general, everything just seemed a bit shit. But honestly, I just think that was because I never really tried to create something for myself. And I quickly realized boredom is simply a lack of attention rather than things being boring. Obviously, that's not always true. But basically, I just don't see how anything can be shit anymore until I've tried to make it myself now, and that's a very liberating headspace to live in, and it also makes you appreciate everything a little bit more. I honestly think it's mad how much we take our environment for granted. Like, why is the pavement curved at that exact angle? If you actually pause and pay attention to ordinary things for more than a few seconds, life suddenly becomes way more stimulating. And honestly, if you have ADHD, this is kind of the ultimate life hack. Finding little drips of dopamine in the most normal, everyday stuff we usually ignore. But again, I just wonder if you can truly appreciate how everything around us has been designed one way or another by a person, if you haven't tried to design and make something yourself. But I'm sure it's possible. And so another very relevant Star Wars quote I have to mention now is from the great Qui-Gon Jinn, who said, "Your focus determines your reality." And so with all that said, I am by no means saying this is the right way to approach creativity, and if you're not experiencing these depths, you're doing it wrong. Absolutely not. I think the moral of the story lies in my initial reaction to that dreaded thought of taking care of myself. I realised whether my family survived or not, those random tragedies were just that, random, and could happen at any time, let alone later on in life. So Dad died 6 years after his initial diagnosis. I realised most of my stress was coming from that sense of anticipation and having no control over the outcome. First-hand experience of this inevitability provided a true acceptance of my own mortality, but also that I had to cultivate some emotional resilience in the present moment, aiming towards a less reactive fight or flight response to these continual, unpredictable life circumstances. And so I realized for me that making artwork or engaging in any creative act is not only the best medicine for negative emotion, but also is a powerful mechanism that should be practiced regularly, both with and without documentation, in order to gain back some psychological control at our own pace, and to gather and organize our thoughts in able to alleviate suffering and trauma, but most importantly, to just lighten up and experience the present experience without thinking and rationalizing. So I believe creativity should be incorporated alongside eating well, sleeping well, and exercising on a daily basis, unless, of course, you're able to do those things in a creative way. I don't think it matters what you do to a degree. Meaning and purpose, for me at least, doesn't come so much from the creative freedom as it does from the limitations and discipline of the creative act itself. However frustrated or crap you think you are at whatever it is you're doing, and no matter how conventional or boring or uncreative your life or occupation may seem, I think it's important to remember creativity isn't just about being artistic or innovative. In fact, problem solving of any kind is a creative act, and with a little curiosity and reframing, you can find creative elements in everything we do, and whatever the profession. Gardeners, bricklayers, engineers, plasterers, plumbers, etc., are all potentially creating something out of nothing, or equally invaluable, maintaining what's already useful or beautiful. All of these processes add value to people's lives that's really hard to comprehend. And so, by inviting a little bit more creativity into our lives and aiming towards something, and to understand how much easier it is to break and destroy something compared to how excruciatingly difficult it can be to make something, let alone make it functional, commercially viable, or beautiful even, has provided me with a deep appreciation and gratitude for all things, and a deep interest in how other people navigate their own lives, both creatively and emotionally. I would love to romanticize my story, being how common it might be, and if I wrote a book, it would probably be called How Art Saved My Life or some shit. But however unrealistic that title sounds, sometimes, every now and again, I think it could be true. All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe. Please drop a comment and like on this video, and share this link with your friends and family if any of this resonated with you. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. Big love. Bye. What do you think of my painting, Ted?
Good.
Don't touch it!